I think it's a very good. It's ongoing. They're still making episodes, but they started 3 years ago to make it, and you either like it or don't like it. I've met people that say, I can't handle that because it's not word for word, but it has a lot of good history and culture in it. We are in Exodus chapter 20. My heading says, the 10 Commandments. You may have heard of them. And God spoke all these words, verse 1 of Exodus 20. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or observe them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning, and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled. And they stood far off and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And the Lord said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, You have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. If you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones. For if you wield your tool on it, you profane it. You shall not go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not exposed on it. We know this as the 10 Commandments. There are certain, for the Jews, they call it the 10 statements that are made. If we were to say that these are good rules to go by, would anyone disagree with that? The good rules for life. If we lived in a world where every one of these were adhered to, there are certain things that would fundamentally change in our society. For if everyone did not commit murder or adultery, and they did not steal, didn't bear false witness, they didn't lie, they didn't covet, we would not need a police force or a standing army, would we? Imagine how it would change the world that we live in. It would be practically, it would be unrecognizable. Now, on one hand, we look at this and say, these are fundamentally moral laws that man could have figured out. It's not too difficult to figure out that it's bad to murder. The average person can figure that out. But there are some people, if we just go back to the 20th century, there were 100 million, that's million with an M, 100 million people that were murdered that were not part of any army. They were murdered by people by the name of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Pol Pot, to name a few. Mr. Mussolini. Yeah, that's not even counting. It's not even counting abortion. Does not count abortion. We're only talking about those people that were murdered. Now that's on top of all that. So we think, well, murdering's bad. But not everybody believes that because they have their own reasons for believing that it's okay to murder certain people. Ethnic reasons, I don't like them, whatever the reason might be. Mao is known to have killed 40 million Chinese just during his reign. 40 million. Russia is known to have killed, they don't even know, between 20 and 40 million. It's just amazing. So we think, okay, thou shalt not murder. That's a pretty good, we could come up with that. Thou shalt not steal. Well, how do you define steal? Take something that doesn't belong to you. You shall not commit adultery. Seems like a pretty good idea. Now, if man came up with these rules, we would say, well, that man could be pretty smart. But we could challenge that. And people have challenged it. But man makes up the rules, we challenge it. God makes up the rule, it's absolute. And that's the difference between saying these are good moral laws to live by. We could have, as a society, we could have come up with these. And saying, God said these, they're absolute. They're true. There is no contradicting it if God said it. Because your average humanist or atheist, they believe it's wrong to murder. For the most part. There are some people that think that murdering people is a way of handling the whole overpopulation, way of handling certain issues. I'm not talking about someone who's convicted, you put them in the electric chair. That's not murder. Murdering is killing someone without reason. So we have this as a fundamental law that God puts forth. And when God puts it forth, it is absolute. There is no other document, no other set of laws that man has come up with that can equal the Ten Commandments in their fundamental state, the 10 statements. Why is it that we are bent as a nation of taking the Ten Commandments out of everywhere? What is it about the Ten Commandments that is so offensive to certain people? Yeah, that's true. Because there's an association with God. Everyone did what was right in their own sight. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they worshiped where they wanted to, they did what they wanted to, and we saw the result of that. But what would happen if we had these rules and God didn't say it? And it wasn't by God that these were written down. We could challenge them. We could change those laws. Anyone familiar with the process of making laws in the United States? It's hard to change a law for a reason. I believe that's one of the reasons why the the Founding Fathers made it so difficult to change things such as the Constitution. They come up with the first 10, and then every time we want to make an amendment, it's a big thing. It ought to be hard to change those. But on the federal level and state level, when you make laws, anybody have an idea of how many new laws were enacted in the United States last year? I don't know how many tens of thousands there have been. The one that comes to mind started July 1st. If you have a cell phone and you're riding in a car and you're the driver, you may not touch it. You may not touch it. Even if you're stopped at a stop sign, you may not pick up that cell phone. That's a law. And things just keep changing. We think, well, and why do they make laws? We could argue that all day. But here, the Ten Commandments. Have the Ten Commandments ever been updated by God? In a sense, they were. In a sense, they were on the Sermon on the Mount, because Jesus further defined them to their most fundamental, foundational meaning when he talked about what it means to be angry. Even to be angry is to commit murder. So it caused people to think greater than simply those 10 that are carved in stone originally. Verse 1 of Exodus 20, and God spoke all these words. Verse 2, I am the Lord your God. He begins to make this. Up to that point, there were personal covenant relationships with people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We said this before. That's how God identified himself. That's how, when Moses said, who do you want me to say sent me? I am. Asher, Haya, Yasher. I am that I am. I am the self-existing God. No one made me. But now he begins to say, I am the Lord. I am Jehovah, your God. I am your God. You are my people. Not the Amorites, not the Hittites, not the Girgashites. We say, well, God's the God over all things. Yes. But those people were his personal people. I am the Lord, your God. Verse 5, you shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord, your God. Verse 7, you shall not take the name of the Lord, your God. Verse 10, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord, your God. Honor your father and mother, that the days may be long in the land that the Lord, your God, is giving you. This giving of the law here in what we call Mount Sinai, it was called Mount Horeb, or the mountain of the Lord, was a fulfillment. And God says, this is how you're going to know that I sent you to do all this. When you come to this mountain to worship me. That's how you know. Of all of the miracles, those were good signs, but he says this is ultimately how you'll know that I sent you. Tells them that back in chapters 3 and 4. This is how you'll know when you come to this mountain, Mount Horeb, or as they would call it, Mount Sinai. When they talk about the wilderness of sin, they're not talking about an area that everyone sinned. That's just what they call it, Sin Sinai. That's what it all meant. So he comes and gives them these 10 statements. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And sometimes we drop down to verse 3 and say, well, that's the beginning. But the fact that he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And fundamentally, it begins right there by showing that God is a God of freedom. I brought you out of the land of slavery. The land of which we've said it over and over, that they longed to go back to because they had lots to eat. I would just love to be a slave if only you would feed me. Does that sound like a logical way to live life? either in that day or this day. I would love for the government to look over me and take care of all of the things, no matter how much they oppress me, if only I have good cell service, good internet, and they give me lots of food to eat. You know, on every level you can think of, would you want to be a slave if it only meant that you got fed? That's really what Israel is saying when they begin to grumble. I wish we were back in Egypt. You come down to that level and think, boy, I would just love to sin again. I would just love to do the things I used to do. Or I'm just going to fall back into my old lifestyle. And really what you're saying is exactly what those in Israel said as they were coming out. I didn't mind being a slave because I enjoyed it. Yes, making bricks. What could be greater? We're making bricks. They're going to see the things we've done for thousands of years. Pyramids, obelisks, whatever it is. But now God sets a different standard that they can go by. And in no other place in history, we could talk about the Sumerians. We can talk about this obelisk that they have that has I'm trying to think, what's the name that I'm trying to think of here, to where they decoded the Hammurabi Code. Okay, the little... Yes, the Rosetta Stone, that's what I'm thinking of which they were able to use that. We have those laws that were made, but they were still made by human beings. Good laws to live by, but laws made by man are subject to change. And all we have to do is have a majority of the states, when they vote by it, and we can change any law in the Constitution if we just have enough votes. And a few other things. It's time-consuming, and we haven't changed a fundamental law in a long time. We haven't added an amendment in a long, long time, but it's possible. But not so with the Ten Commandments. No one has ever been able to come up with the 11th commandment. I don't know, what would you add if you could add an 11th commandment? What could you come up with that is not covered in these 10 statements? No cell phones in traffic. Prove me wrong right there. No cell phones in traffic. There are 613 laws that the Jews went by. 10 of them were these. The others had to do with sacrifices, the things that you could eat, unclean, clean, how you would dress. All of those things were covered, but these 10 are the fundamental that cannot be broken down. We talk in terms of math, prime numbers, numbers that cannot be divisible by any other whole number. 1, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23. Someone stop me here. 29. Those numbers that you can't divide them by 2, 3, 4, they're prime numbers. Indivisible. And that's what these 10 are. You cannot break them down. You cannot say, well, that one's not a good one. But for the Jews, or the Israelites at that time, they wouldn't be Jews for several hundred more years. As he comes with these two, and especially something as, when you think of it, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. It's perhaps, for me, is one of the most enigmatic in the group. I don't disagree with it, but honoring your father and mother, we don't give it much thought, is up there with thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not lie. It's one of which Jesus questioned those in the first century. They talked about this law of Corban, in which you are going to leave it for your parents to have them taken care of. But she said, no, we're going to give that, we're going to call it Corban, so we didn't have to give it, so we could give it into the treasury. And Jesus did not agree with that. because it was part of the fundamental law, and one in which even Paul says it's the first commandment with a promise. The first commandment with a promise. And what is that promise? That your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. I believe it's still true for us today to treat and honor our parents. I don't think it's ever gone out of vogue. It's a little tough to understand in this day and age, isn't it? Our culture's different.
Way different.
You know, should we put them in nursing homes? Should we take care of them at home? That's not really the issue. The fact that you honor your father and mother. And the question will always come up, well, what if my parents really don't treat me nice? Where's the exception in this law that says if your parents don't teach you nice, you should not honor them? And I know there are some tough cases out there that people could make some pretty good arguments for the way they've been abused. But there is an honor that is due for parents. And would it be that every parent was good to their child? That everything that we can find that is good in life that would make for a perfect world, not a sinless world, but a world in which we wouldn't have no need for armies, for law enforcement. We may need ambulance. People are going to fall down and break their leg. But how different the world would be if we simply adhered to these things. Now, the toughest one for us to grasp has to be number 4, which is, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, or the livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. Think of how that would change the world in that day.
Interesting thing I just read about Charlie Kirk. But that he keeps the Sabbath. He's a Christian and he worships on Sunday, but he still feels that the day of rest was established, and so he does follow that himself. And I just wondered how many of us think about that, because Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And maybe one of the things that we have incorporated kind of into our thinking is that we no longer observe a day of rest. Sunday is a day of worship, not necessarily a day of rest for some people.
Was there a question in that?
Was there a question? Well, is that to be observed today?
Charles Kirk, is that his name?
Charlie Kirk. Yeah.
Charlie Kirk? If Charlie Kirk wants to observe the Sabbath and he's not using it as a way of justification for grace, I'm not going to argue with him. I'm not going to argue with anyone who says they want a Sabbath day of rest. It is not required of us. Paul clearly says that when he writes to the church in Colossians. When he talks about that, he says, let no one judge you in these matters, whether you do or whether you don't. But remember, Paul is still in a time to which the law is observed. And he is writing this before the destruction of Jerusalem. And when the destruction of Jerusalem comes about, that really is fundamentally the end of Judaism. It's the end of it. He had given them that, if you want to call it a grace period of 40 years, from AD 30 to AD 70. There was a time in which the gospel was to go out. But Paul says that it's gone to everywhere in the world. It had gone to all of these places. It had gone to Europe, it had gone to Asia, it had gone to Africa, places to where there were synagogues. So they knew the difference in it.
people will want to keep certain days and some won't, and that's individual choice.
Mhm.
sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah, if I, would it make a difference if I wanted to keep Friday? I'm going to do everything on Friday that a Jew or people who are Sabbatarians, those who still observe the Sabbath, I'm going to do everything or not do everything on Friday that people do on Saturday. Does it count?
That's a Romans 14 thing.
Yeah. It's,
We need to start calling it 9 commandments.
yeah. Yeah. The, and he says that's a Romans 14 where Paul talks about opinions that people have. And remember that in that day, there was parts of people that were still observing the law. Now, there are people that say, well, Sunday is the new Sabbath. There's nowhere in Scripture that Sunday is the new Sabbath. Mike?
I gotta tell you an interesting story. So somebody was cleaning their stove. It was a new electronic stove, you know, just wiping it over and pushing all the buttons. And the stove wasn't working. And on the display it said 5AB. So I looked it up. And it wasn't 5AB, it was Sabbath. And so appliances still have Sabbath mode to this very day. I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Does that justify never cleaning your stove again?
Is it justification for never cleaning your stove again? And there are religious groups within Christendom that still want to observe Saturday. Yeah, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Worldwide Church of God, which used to be under Herbert W. Armstrong, his son, I forget what his name is, but there are groups that say that we are still bound by the law in this. But the law as a form of justification is not in effect. That doesn't mean that it is that it's okay to murder, that it's okay to lie, it's okay to covet. But the law as a way of justifying one's faith is no longer valid. And it never was, because Paul says it's simply a way of showing what was right and wrong. That's all the law. It was the schoolmaster that led to Christ. So if it led it to Christ, is it still valid as a system of justification?
Did he not say that it has been fulfilled?
Yes, he said it's fulfilled. I said, I didn't come here to take it away. I've not come to abolish it. I've come to fulfill it. Tim?
Jesus speaking about the comparison of the two laws, and he says the law, the old law written on tablets of stone, and bringing a new law, it's written on hearts of men.
Mm-hmm.
There is the timeless moral code right there. No matter how rotten to the core a person is, there is a moral code that's part of your conscience, part of your soul.
Mm-hmm.
And if you will listen to the Holy Spirit, it'll help you. If you don't, that can't help you.
Yeah.
It's a timeless moral code that's written on your heart. And your heart will hurt you when you're contemplating doing something wrong.
Mhm.
The world calls it a red flag, but it's really the conscience.
Yeah. One of the things that a king in Israel was required to do when he became king was to write a copy of the law. That's written. Moses gave that. When you get a king, that king shall write a copy of the law. So King Saul was to do it, King David, King Solomon, and right on down. Rehoboam, all of those were to write it. So how did that happen when Jesus became king? How did he write that law? And Tim, you just said it. He's going to write that law on our hearts.
He calls it cold tablets of stone, and it is referred to as written on the warm heart of man. You've got two, you know, you just said it in your sermon this morning. Some things are totally different, but they are actually exactly alike. They never change.
Mhm.
And how you don't understand that until you're faced with some choices, how that law under Moses was a written law on paper, you read it and you obey it. When Jesus comes and says, you're still gonna do this, I'm gonna just tear it right out, tear those pages right out of our book, out of God's word, but, I think that God would much rather have given a new law and left it and had it rule the hearts of men from the kingdom. But if you notice, when he gave these 10 commandments, these people were like children. They were simpletons. They had to think now for themselves after 400 some odd years of being under the law of a whip and a stick, and told how to think and how to do everything. Now they're going to have to, if he had given the new law first, they wouldn't have been able to do it.
Mhm.
And so he gives them the simple law. It's complex law, but it's pretty simple. You do this, and you don't do that. And if you do, then this is going to happen. You get into the new law, now your heart has to tell you. Didn't take a lot of heart to, thou shalt not kill, doesn't take a whole lot of heart. But apparently under that law, I could beat my neighbor to within an inch of his life, and I haven't broken the law. And Jesus comes along and brings this new law, and the Pharisees say, oh, wait. We don't want it written on our hearts. We like it on paper. We'll just leave it right where it is. And Christians have that timeless moral code firmly stamped on our hearts, and that's what leads us, what compels a person to do something extraordinary.
Mhm.
That's what it is.
Yeah, and when you realize and understand who was the law given to, it was given to Israel. It was not given to Egypt. It was not given to the Hittites. It wasn't given to the Gauls. It wasn't given to anyone except God's people. And so when we speak of that, there was a time, and especially when he says that that law, the Hebrew writer talks about this new covenant that comes in. He says, and what is old and aging is passing away. And in a sense, we talk about the shadow of it. And what is the rest that we would have today if we're talking of that Sabbath? What's the rest? Yeah, and today, I'm not working for my salvation. It took a lot of work. And there were people that could fulfill the law for a few days. There were people, if they really worked at it, and the rabbis talk about this in their teaching, that there were times when someone could go the entire week and never break one of the commandments. Not one of the 10, not one of the 613. But they eventually would. There's some people that could live it perfectly for a short period of time. But they couldn't do it in perpetuity like Christ did.
And Jesus is the one that makes us perfect.
Mhm.
Without him, we are nothing.
Yeah.
It reminds me that we all sin and fall short of glory of God.
And under Christ, we may sin, but we are not slaves to sin. It's not something that drives us. Is the huge difference. So the great chapter is this incredible, I would call it a document, but it's not a document. And in fact, when God carves it on these stone tablets here, it won't be but just a little while until God says, you better go down there because they're going wild. And Moses gets down there and breaks the tablets because they've made the golden calf, And Aaron says, I just threw it into there, and out came this calf. That must have been really cool. So Moses breaks the tablets. He's got to go back up on the mountain, and God writes the Ten Commandments again. And those 10 Commandments were kept in the Ark of the Covenant there.
That is the most coveted piece of history, any artifact known.
Yeah, just watch
It's so sought after.
Raiders of the Lost Ark. You'll see how coveted.
Show after show, they're trying to find it. And
Yeah.
I wonder where it's at. It'd be
Mhm.
interesting.
Yeah.
It may not even exist anymore.
And you stated the dimensions at one time, they were quite large, weren't they?
The Ark of the Covenant?
No, the tablets.
The tablets probably were small,
Oh, they were?
were very small. Remember, he carried them down from the mountain.
Put them in a pot.
But the picture shows them this big.
Yeah, and they're round on top, yeah. And they were, remember, they were written on both sides. So they probably were fairly small. They didn't have to be big. They're not as big as the one that they took down in the Alabama courthouse. I don't, we don't know how big, but they were small enough to fit inside of the Ark of the Covenant, which was smaller than this. The Ark of the Covenant was only 1.5 by 2.5 by 2.5. Small enough but it was coated with gold, made of acacia wood, and then coated with gold, plus the mercy seat that was on top that was solid gold. So gold is pretty heavy. But it was such that they had the rings and 4 people could carry it. I made a replica of it one time, but I made it out of Luan, and I used gold spray paint to make it look nice. So,
Thinking back to my childhood, growing up Catholic, they had a similar symbol of that. They still do behind their altar kind of thing.
oh, so we can go there and see it. Okay,
Those dimensions that you just said.
yeah.
Look at
Yeah.
them, yeah.
Grace?
So the Catholics that have, figures in the church building, could they be considered idols?
Well, there's debate over that. They say no, they're not idols, but
What did Martin Luther say?
Martin Luther recognized them as idols. Yeah.
They certainly parade them.
Interestingly enough, if you look at the 10 Commandments we have, they are different than what certain religious groups within Christendom state. They've taken out the idol, and they've added another one into that. They've divided one of them into 2 and taken one out for it. Look it up. So, I'm not going to identify that group, although we already have here, but I'm not going to.